Hi, this is Ed Pullen, your host on the Bird Banter podcast. And this is Bird Banter podcast episode number 3 with Bruce LaBar as my guest today. You'll hear more from Bruce in a minute, but you can find the Bird Banter podcast on the iTunes Store, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you find your podcast feeds. Please subscribe to the podcast, share the podcast with your friends, and enjoy. Bruce LaBar is my guest today. Hey, Bruce.
How you doing, Ed?
I'm doing great. Bruce is a birding buddy of mine for a lot of years, but more so in the last couple of years. I moved to Tacoma about a year and a little bit ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and he lives about a mile from me, and both of us are mostly retired, and it's real convenient to get out with Bruce. He is a hotshot birder. He grew up in He grew up as a birder in Southern California. He'll tell you his story, and moved here quite a while ago, and currently is the #1 lister on eBird in both Washington and Pierce County. Yay, Bruce!
Wow.
So anyway, Bruce, tell us how you get started in birding.
That is, I actually got started back in the early 70s as far as looking at birds. But I'd like to tell a little story about my 7th grade experience back in Cadillac, Michigan, where I was born and raised.
Great name, Cadillac.
Cadillac, nothing to do with the cars, however, but a nice little resort town. And we had a 7th grade project, and the teacher told us to go out and to identify 10 birds. And so I thought, oh, well, that's going to be easy. And I went out and I saw a crow, maybe a robin, and then it got hard. I couldn't find things. So I found a bird book that was in our classroom, and I just wrote down 8 other birds. And I handed it in, and the teacher said, well, that's really good, Bruce, except about 5 of those aren't found in Michigan. And I went, oh, okay. And so
Cheat, never beat.
So I had to go out, and I do remember seeing a mourning dove and a robin, blue jay, red-winged blackbird, and I think I finished the project. But it kind of piqued my interest a little bit in, looking around, but I never pursued birding. So ended up going to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, and I met my first wife, whose name was Prudy. And we got married in 68, and we graduated in 69, 1970, and we decided we wanted to leave Michigan. When I got out of high school, I had taken a year off and kind of hitchhiked all around the country and ended up in Pomona, California, of all places. And I wanted to get back to California. I thought that was a cool place. And so we quit our jobs, got a brand new Datsun station wagon, and bought a whole bunch of backpacking equipment, which was the new rage at the time. I remember a book coming out called The Complete Walker, and we bought all these great stuff, and we had hardly any experience in hiking. I had Boy Scouts, and that was about it.
But so you had the gear.
Yeah, I know. And so we took off, and we hiked in upper Michigan and went through thunderstorms and blisters and all that. Ended up in Yellowstone, excuse me. Yellowstone and Glacier and Banff, and along the way we kept seeing wildlife, and we had a little pocket books on plants and mammals, and I think we had one pocket book on birds, if I'm not mistaken. I remember seeing a raven in Yellowstone on a post, and it was the biggest bird I think I ever saw. It was just humongous sitting on this post, and I went, wow, and I knew that was a raven, and ended up in Washington. We had friends who, we were college friends, and he got drafted and was at Fort Lewis in Tacoma. And they lived in Stellicum. And so we stayed with them for a couple months and got them into backpacking. And we thought we were going to live in Washington, but the rains came and we decided to head south. One of our backpacking trips, was we went up to Mount Rainier, and I remember we were hiking the Summerland Trail or something, and I laid down, and I was eating some trail mix, and I fell asleep. And I got up, and all these Canada jays were all over me. And
AKA great jays, yes, at the time.
Or camp robbers or whatever, and I didn't know what the hell they were, and I wanted to know what they were. And so I remember this actually going to the guide and trying to find it, and I did. And I think lot of birders talk about signature birds, and I think the bird it kind of got you into looking or
Right.
listing or whatever. And so I've always said Canada Jay, and to this day, it's one of my favorite birds. And anyways, after that, we made it on down to Santa Cruz, California, and we found we loved it down there. We were into alternative foods, we're vegetarians, and we were into yoga, and Santa Cruz was perfect at that time. This is 1971. And we ended up in a couple places, and we ended up finally in a house that we rented, a little cabin house, and there were birds everywhere, and I couldn't figure out what they were. There was, like, I remember hooded orioles and house finches and hummingbirds and, things I had no experience with. And then the local paper, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, had an article about a bird walk, and sponsored by the Santa Cruz Bird Club. So I got real excited, and I told my wife, I said, I really want to go on this. So I
And she made the mistake of saying okay.
Yeah, she made it. Oh my gosh, did she ever? And little did she know what she was in for. Excuse me.
Have a drink.
Pause.
That's good.
Have a drink.
Little iced tea gets the voice going again.
And so then I went on this bird walk, and I am now 73 years old. And I think the bird walk that I went on, most of the people were probably that age. And I was the youngest thing they had seen in a long time. So they kind of took me under their wing.
Sure.
And they were just real excited to have young people, and I was amazed. I mean, they were going, over here's a flicker, and over here's rent it, and over here's this, and I'm going, how do you know that? And they said, well, we know sounds, and that fascinated me, and they were real sharp. They shared a scope, and I saw a bunch of birds I'd never seen before.
Sure.
And I was hooked. And so I think I joined the club, and there was there's about two other people that were of my age, kind of. One guy was named Randy Morgan, and he was a local Santa Cruz bird record keeper, and he was an unbelievable naturalist. He knew every plant in Santa Cruz County, and he worked as a environmental, what do they call them, environmental specialist, and he'd be hired to go out
Right.
and to
Inventory a survey.
inventory an area before it was, developed or whatever. He knew all the grasses, he knew all the birds. Fascinating person, and he taught me a lot. And then I kept going on field trips, a lot of these people, and then University of Santa Cruz started to really expand. And a bunch of people, younger people, showed up and that were interested in birds. So I got some of those people involved with the bird club.
Uh-huh.
And then what? And then I actually started becoming proficient, and so they let me lead a few trips or co-lead, and that was real fun. And I think in 1970, let me look at my notes here. In 74, I met a person named Jim Morris. And Jim had lived in Ocean Shores, Washington, which is one of our
hot spots.
Where Ed and I go a lot, and we actually do a Christmas count out there together. Anyways, he had got out of the Navy, for some reason ended up in Ocean Shores, and he was a very proficient birder. And he got together with Gene Hunn, who was one of the
Gene
main...
was down there then?
No, he was in Seattle.
Oh, in Seattle, yes,
But
okay.
he somehow or another got a hold of Gene, and Gene was one of the big birders in Washington, along with Terry Wall and Dennis Paulson and a few others. Anyways, they started the Christmas count out at Ocean Shores way back in 1974. And so he left there and moved down to Santa Cruz, and he was going to school at the college, and we became really good friends, and my wife liked him a lot, and he was a good guy. And he said, hey, there's this other world out there that you don't know about. And then he talked about the American Birding Association and about all these amazing places to go and birds to see, and about listing. Well, back in Michigan, I probably had the biggest baseball card collection of anybody in Cadillac. And I was really into collecting. And that really perked my interest.
Collecting a list
collecting
is even
and
better.
listing and,
it's
you know,
easy
all
to
that.
store.
And so that perked me up a bunch. And I remember going with Jim, and we went down to Mount Pinos and got to see the condors before they were brought in. Took a trip to Arizona with him, and it was just amazing to go up to Madeira Canyon and all those places and just seeing birds.
Southeast Arizona is magic.
Opened my eyes a whole bunch. And then, well, after that, we lost touch, and I think he went on to Berkeley to become a dentist or something, and I haven't seen him since, but he was a real good mentor for me at the time. Meanwhile, people kept coming to the university and joining the bird club, and I got a part-time job at a outdoor camp that sixth graders from various schools would go to. It's called Redwood Glen, and it was up in the mountains of Santa Cruz. And I was a maintenance and custodian person there. And two of the people that ran the outdoor camp were birders. And they had bird feeders all over the camp. And they went out owling at night with these kids and everything else. And one of the people became a really good friend of mine named Bob Hargis. And he helped me a lot identify birds that were coming to the feeders and stuff like that. And he was a bird club member as well.
Sure.
And then what? I guess the time that I had not met many of the main people in California then at that time that were really cutting the new world of birding. And I mainly birded around Santa Cruz or Palo Alto or the Bay Area. I did meet a couple people like Rich Stalkop and Don Roberson and a few of these people who are kind of legends in the California birding. But we actually started our own little group, and I met a person named Steve Allison and Carolyn Fredrickson, Dennis Parker, Steve Getty, Don Starks, and Dave Ekdahl. And we formed a little group that we were chasing stuff all over the place and using each other's cars and go up to Point Reyes. And the way we'd hear about it was there was a phone
tree.
Well, before the phone tree, there was a weekly phone
hotline, sure,
which was run by a guy named Joe Moreland, who was one of the main birders in California at the time and a teacher at one of the colleges. And so every Thursday or Friday, we'd listen for Joe Moreland, his tape, and he'd say, oh, there's been a couple warblers at Point Reyes, or there's this or that. And we would go, and of course, it could have been a week.
Yeah, 6
before.
days too late, sorry.
And sorry, but sometimes we were lucked out and we were able to find these birds.
Well, we had that in Washington for many years.
Yeah, along with Gene Hahn.
Sure.
And then we actually became quite proficient and kept meeting more of the hotshot birders in California, and were welcomed into on a phone tree. And a phone tree worked throughout California and became friends with people in Southern California like Paul Lehman and John Dunn and those folks. Mm-hmm. And they would call one of us in the Santa Cruz area, and then it was our job to spread the word throughout Santa Cruz.
Those were the long distance phone calls days.
Exactly.
Yeah, you made it a quick call.
And those were that's how we were able to end up at a Denny's at 5:00 in Santa Maria to look for something, and all of us would be there, and it was a wonderful way of getting around. It was certainly an interesting time and hopefully you got accepted into that.
Earning your way into the phone tree was not a small task. Yeah.
Right. You had to kind of prove your colors. And then about that time, the late 70s, Debbie Shearwater, I think her name at the time was Debbie Milchap.
Okay.
And Debbie loved Milchap. And she came from Texas, and she ended up in the Monterey area, and she really got into pelagic birding, obviously. And,
Yes. Shearwater Journeys.
And so I had been, my first pelagic was, looking at my notes, in September 76, and my second was in 78. And that was before Debbie started the trips. I think Santa Cruz Bird Club or the Monterey Audubon sponsored them.
Put them together.
And I was really hooked on pelagic birding. And then Debbie started her tour group, and that just took off. And obviously, you know, she became famous, Debbie Shearwater. And I did a lot of pelagics with her. I don't know if I was a regular spotter, but I certainly helped on a few trips, and that's how I really cut my teeth on pelagic birding. In 1980, on one of the trips, I met an interesting character named Bruce Barrett, and he was from England.
Isn't he the number 1 ABA lister now, or number two? Number two, I guess. Yeah.
Just about that. He travels all over, and we became really good friends. And our wives liked each other. We both had kids, and anyways, he worked as a tech computer person for some big firm, and basically could do a lot of stuff anytime, anywhere, and he had a lot of time to travel.
Good things for a birder.
Oh, you bet. So,
Especially a lister.
and he became part of the phone tree, and we would hear about things, and away we'd go. And I look at my notes, and it seemed like I was gone way too much, and wasn't exactly good for a non-birding spouse, and having 2 young kids, and
Yeah.
it certainly didn't help my marriage at that time, that's for sure. But saw a lot of birds, saw a lot of places in California, and it really was nothing to travel from Santa Cruz to San Diego and back in one day just to see a bird or not see it. And that was just crazy stuff. So anyways, chased all over California, and then met many of the California birders that time. And Guy McCaskey, of course, kind of the father of birding in California. And one of my favorite people was Rich Dahlkopf, who just recently passed away a couple years ago, and very interesting guy who lived up in Point Reyes Station and Bolinas, that area, and always took time to teach us new things and field ID. Wrote a couple books. Got to meet, everybody from John Donne to Paul Lehman to there's just a lot of great people I got to know. At the same time, I became very active in our bird club and became the program director and field trip director, and I was the Christmas count compiler for, oh my gosh, probably 10, 12 years. And as a program director, I was always trying to get people to come, so I was able to actually hook some of these people to come and talk and give
Very cool,
slideshows.
yeah.
And I remember Arnold Small came up, and I remember we had Keith Hansen, who's a tremendous artist who's done a lot of artwork for various bird books. And Don Roberson would always come up from Monterey, or Debbie would talk about pelagics, and it was really a fun gig.
Yeah, that sounds like it kind of makes our little ABA club look like nothing, doesn't it? Yeah.
No, it was pretty special, and the club was really fun. Anyways,
So Bruce, I'm going to interrupt for a second.
you bet.
Bruce, before we came, I printed out this Who Was Who in California Birding page from Don Roberson's Kriegerist.com. I'll leave those links in the podcast notes about who's who. And he has a page of 40 people who between 65 and 89 were the who's who of California birding. And Bruce really had fun looking at this. I know him. Yeah, so some of these names, he's thumbing through that page as he thinks of people to talk about.
Well, a lot of these people are just amazing birders and very and biologists. And Kimball Garrett, for instance, is one of the curators for one of the LA museums, I believe. And, they're just incredible. And a lot of them are tour leaders, like John Donne.
Sure. John Sterling is one of his faces.
John Sterling was just a young'un then.
Yeah.
But he was very sharp. Steve Bailey was a curator at a museum. Yeah, there's just some amazing people here.
Trip down memory lane.
One of the favorite things we'd do is Memorial Day in California in the 1980s was real special, and a lot of us throughout California would end up in Death Valley. And there were times where there'd be 50 to 60 people there, and they're all birders. And there was all these places you would go in Death Valley, and you'd spend 4 days there. And the idea was to find unusual birds that are lost, and they end up at these hot spots in the desert. And so we'd have these camp outs and sleep on the golf course where you're not supposed to, but unbelievable birds would be found. And we didn't have any way of communicating. We didn't have cell phones. So what you'd do, if you're at Furnace Creek in Death Valley, there would be a rock that everybody knew about. And you'd go to that rock and you'd overturn it, and there's people's notes from what they had seen.
Like geocaching.
Right. And then you would drive up into Nevada, and you'd go up back into California to Oasis and Deep Springs and some of these places. And each place had a place where there'd be notes. And that's how you knew who had been there before or whatever.
Sure.
And sometimes it was way too late, and often you'd be driving down a road, a straight road out in the desert, and a car would be going by, and all of a sudden you just come to these screeching halts because you realize they're both birders, and you'd share notes, and it was a lot of fun, and got to know a lot of these people that way. That's about it for California.
Yeah. And when did you move to Washington?
In 1989, Prudy and I decided our marriage was having a little bit of problem, and so we ended up moving up to Olympia. Our friends were still in Stellicum, and they set us up for a place to stay briefly, and then we found our own place. And promptly, about a year, maybe a year later, Prudy and I decided to split and get a divorce. And at the same time, when I left California, Paul Lehman told me when I moved to Olympia, to look up this one guy named Bill Twight. And he says, you two will hit it off. So after Prudy and I split, I got my own place, and I gave Bill a call, and the rest is history. I mean, Bill he's one of the better birders in Washington, and he just showed me everything in Washington. We traveled all over. He was going through a similar situation. So between our jobs, we traveled a lot, and we ended up in every part of Washington you can think of, in Oregon. We went to Arizona, down to California, and later, in years later, we've been all over too. We've been up to Alaska 3 times, and to North Carolina, and very close friend, and one of my main teachers of.
He is an extraordinary bird.
Very, very.
Oh my
good.
goodness.
And so then, in 1991, I met Marion out at Ocean Shores, of all places.
Really?
She's a non-birder.
Yeah.
But she was asked to go along with a couple of my good friends, Marcus Roning and Heather Balish, who are very close friends and who are birders. And they had taken Marion along because they had a couple of young, some guys going with them, and they thought, well, maybe Marion will hook up with these, and she didn't, thankfully. I was on a Pelagic trip, and I went to pick my roommate up at the time, who was with them, and who was named Tom Schooley. And I met Marion, and a few months later, we were together, and in 1992, we married, and we've been married since. So
she knew what she was getting into.
She knew what she was getting into. She knew about Marcus and how he birds, and they had told her everything about birding and what I was like, and it worked out.
She didn't mind having her own space.
That's true, and plus she loves to go places and hike, and so it's
she's very nice.
Yeah. So then Bill got me into the Pelagic scene in 1992.
Yeah. Westport Seabirds.
And I've been a spotter since 1992, and I've been on, I wrote it down here, see it? I've been on 234 trips out of Westport, which is
That's extraordinary.
Amazing.
I can give a shout out to Westport Seabirds. Again, I'll leave a note in the link in the podcast notes. Aren't they the longest continuous database of pelagic sightings in America, if not the world?
In the world.
Yeah,
In the world,
they're
yeah. So
run an extraordinary trip if anyone wants to go pelagic birding in the northwest of the U.S. Westport Seabirds.
yeah, one of the things we do is we record numbers as we go, and that's been a real boon for science. Actually, several papers have been written, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Anyone who hasn't been on a pelagic trip, your first time out, you'll see a speck in the sky, and the spotters will shout out, "Skua, skua," and you're like, huh? Where's that? Oh.
So then Marion lived in Tacoma. I moved to Tacoma in 1992, promptly joined the Tacoma Audubon Society, and met a lot of the local birders. And Bill had already met, through his knowledge and connections, I'd met most of the people in Washington who were into birding and traveling, and so that's helped a lot.
Yeah.
Got to.
It's a community.
Oh, it's a real big community.
Getting to know the birders in your area is just makes such a difference in terms of your experience and the things you see and how much you learn, how much fun you have.
Exactly. So I think that's about it.
Yeah. Bruce, I thought we'd talk a little bit about last year, birding in Pierce County.
Okay.
Do you remember how we came up with the idea? I think it was something like, was it Matt Bartell sent out an email or in his notes said that there were only 2 or 3 counties in Washington who had a big day every month of the year or something like that?
That could have been the reason.
I think that was, and I think I got a hold of you and I said, well, we should do that over 2 years. Let's just not push ourselves. Let's take 2 years, and over 2 years, let's try to get a big day in every month. And it goes, Bruce says, 2 years? That's not happening. So we just did a big day every month of 2018. Had a lot of fun doing that.
That's correct. And
some of them were not so big, but they set a bar.
Well, there's a website called Washington Birder.
Right.
And maybe Ed will put that on there.
Yeah, I can do that too.
And that's for a lot of us who are listers, and it's run by Ken and Lori Knittel down in Vancouver, Washington. They do a real good job, and Matt Bartels is one of the main.
I think he's a webmaster.
He's a webmaster, and he also keeps the list up to date and what's unusual.
Isn't he the guy who does it for the whole state? I know you're the Pierce County curator or Pierce County record keeper or whatever you call it.
I send stuff to Matt every couple months.
Right.
Yeah. But it's a fun thing, and each year you get your names published and where you stand in the counties and all that, and it's a lot of fun. Where am I going with that?
So we start out in January.
So on the Washington Birder page, there's a part that tells where there's been big days for every county.
Right.
And Ed, I believe, saw it, and I've seen it too. And where there's, I think, Skamania and one other county has a big day every month. And for Pierce County, it's only been May, because we usually do a big day in May for bird.
Because that's when you can get the biggest day.
Right. And so we decided, Ed and I decided, well, let's just do it. So we started out in January last year, and I think we got 100 birds.
We were close to 100 if we weren't 100, yeah.
And, and it's fun. You start out in the morning, you try to get a barred owl, maybe a great horned owl. I think last year we had a saw-whet owl
was at Point Defiance,
Yeah. And then February, Ed had, his wife was very sick, and he couldn't go on February's trip. And then Ed was on every trip after that.
Yeah.
That May, we did a big day with Will
and Ken.
Will and Ken Brown.
Ken was my guest on podcast number 2 last week.
Right. So the 4 of us, a couple years before that, I was part of a group that set the Pierce County Big Day record, which was, I think, 137 birds in the county in one day. And I had Ryan Shaw and Ryan Merrill, Charlie Wright, Annie Meyer, Peter Wimberger, his wife.
Hot shot, young
So
years.
we really went everywhere and ended up at Paradise, up at Mount Rainier. Last year, the four of us never even got up to Longmire. I don't believe. Did
No, we did a low ground.
just low ground, and we had 134, which was amazing for not getting up into the high elevations. So that was real fun.
I think we decided that, it's 3 or 4 hours of time just to get up there and back.
Right,
And
right.
we would miss a lot of low elevation stuff, and we could do just about as well.
And
I think that's true.
We did really well. And then throughout the the months, we would change it. Usually we started out at Purdy and out at Fox Island and kind of worked our way.
Got our bay birds
Get
first.
the bay birds and seabirds and loons or whatever. But in the summer, that's kind of hard. So we started mixing it up a bit, and we started up in higher elevations and worked our way down a couple times, and that was
Just
fun.
mostly just tried things out and had fun doing it.
And every month we got a big day.
We
now
set a bar.
Pierce County is one of the counties that has
We
something
are one
for
of the
every month.
haves. We are one of the haves, not the have-nots.
In February, I think I was on my own. I think I ended up with like 70 birds, and I think the norm was probably 80 to 90.
80 to 90 most months, except migration months were a little bit better.
You bet. But it was a lot of fun. And if you haven't done a big day, it's fun just to see what you can do.
It is. So
Okay.
anyway, I thought we could talk. When I really got to know Bruce was when I was his roommate on a trip to Africa. Bruce was looking for a roommate on a trip.
You were not a roommate.
I wasn't, was I?
No, Kay was with us.
Kay was. I'm so
yeah.
yeah. How could I forget that? Anyway, was looking for a couple people to fill out a trip so that it
Right.
would actually go.
Right.
And so we went to Kenya in November of 2016. My first guided non-ABA area trips. I was like a real novice, but we had a lot of fun on that trip. A fellow named James Bradley led the trip, along with John Sterling. John Sterling is one of the people on the who's who in California birding we just talked about. He's a trip leader now as a big part of his employment. And James Bradley is just this fascinating younger guy, 40-ish or so, who grew up in Kenya. He's going to be my guest next week on the podcast, so get to know James. And was a crazy cool trip.
It was amazing. A place I'd always wanted to go to, and I'd known John Sterling from California days, and somewhere on Facebook or something, he mentioned I needed people to fill out this trip. So I got a hold of him and signed up, and then I was able to get Ed and Kay to come along.
That's right.
And that filled, I think we only had 7, 8
There was just
people.
7 of us plus the leaders, yeah.
And so it was very easy, and we had a driver and
Isaac.
and he was awesome. And the way that James had set it up, having known Kenya, he kind of took us from one side of Kenya to the other side, and including mountains, and even went out on a lake and Lake Victoria, and we ended up on the coast, the Indian Ocean, right?
Yes.
And did a lot of shore birding and stuff like that. So I ended up, and I'm sure Ed did
We had
too.
identical numbers. Yeah.
I had 530.
547 species seen, of which for me they were almost all lifers. You'd been around, so they weren't all for you.
Well,
But
I think I got over 500 lifers.
that was
It
crazy.
was
Yeah.
pretty crazy. Maybe 400.
Yeah, I'm guessing more 400. But it was a lot. It was, and James was so. I mean, we'd be driving along at 50 miles an hour, and he'd point out a little bird flying, and he'd identify it. And we're like, he can't identify that. We'd stop. He was right every single time.
Well, plus you'll find out next week on the podcast. James knows everything about Kenya. I mean, he knows some languages. He knows the plants. Just the history of Kenya, and it was very,
You know, the geology, the botany, the insects, the people. It was so cool.
It was great.
It was so cool. Anyway, I think, Bruce, I'm going to sort of wrap it up.
Okay.
And I'd like to ask a few questions of each of my guests. So first, what's your favorite ABA bird guide? What do you use mostly?
Well, of course, both Ed and I, we use the Sibley app when we're out birding in
the field,
In
yeah.
the field, and you don't have to carry
Phone
around
apps
a
are
big,
pretty much taken away,
Right.
carrying a big book around.
But my favorite guide is actually the National Geographic guide. I remember getting that back, the first edition, like in 1983, and I think I've had, out of the 7 editions, I think I got 4 of them or something. I like it because it has a lot of the subspecies. It has a lot of the rarities that Sibley doesn't focus on so much.
Yeah.
But Sibley's book is very, very
Pretty good. They both are great.
Yep.
Yeah, they both are great. And if you had one place that's just sort of your dreamy sort of place to go in the ABA, what's your favorite spot?
That I hadn't been to?
No, that you've been to.
I've been to, well, Southeast Arizona. There's going to be multiple ones here. Anywhere in southern Texas, Rio Grande. My favorite place in California is Point Reyes and Yosemite. And
Yosemite, would not have.
I used
think
to
that would make a list.
I led a lot of trips up to Yosemite, and I love that area because you can go up there.
Serious,
and work
you can drive to 11,000 feet.
and then you go down to Mono Lake, and
Yeah.
so you get this unbelievable habitat variety of
Sure.
birds. Yeah.
You mostly go there in the fall, or would you go other times?
Well, usually in the summer.
Summer?
Yeah, because that's when things are singing and
Okay.
stuff.
I think of Mono Lake as a stopover. Is it eared grebes at Mono
ear
Lake?
grebes and all sorts of avocets are everywhere. And
Yeah.
It's just very cool.
Yeah. And if you had one place you haven't been yet in the ABA that is on your got to get there list.
Well, I know Ed's been there, and that's Cape May would be one. And I'd like to go
Oh,
to
I didn't realize you hadn't been to Cape May. Oh, that is
and
wonderful.
I'd like to go to McGee Marsh, too.
Yeah.
During probably that warbler time.
Yeah. Anyway, Bruce, how can, if anyone wants to find you online or wants to get a hold of you, is there the way that could happen?
I'm on Facebook.
Are you Bruce LaBar?
Yeah, just Bruce LaBar, and you're certainly welcome.
I'll put a link to that in
Sure,
the podcast notes.
You bet.
Good.
And then one of your questions here said something about what's next. I think.
Yeah. What's next?
Well, next, Ed and I.
Yeah, we've got a big trip coming.
Are going to Africa again. Only
Yes.
to Morocco. And
Yeah, if you look at a map of Africa and Europe, Spain comes down to a point, and Africa comes to a point, and they almost touch there. Is that the Suez Canal?
no.
Anyways, little
Straits of Gibraltar. There.
Straits of Gibraltar. There's a little body of water between, but that is a real landmass link between the two continents. So we're going in April. Should be spectacular migration.
And we're going with a person who used to be one of the big birders in Washington, who was a priest named Michael Carmody. He gave up his priesthood
Priesthood,
job,
whatever.
priesthood for a long time ago, and has been a tour leader for many years now, 20 plus years, with Legacy Tours.
And I'll put a link there too.
Yeah, and he does a lot in Mexico, but he's got this one trip, and Ed and I are going, and 2 of our friends are going, Marcus and Heather, and so it'll be really a lot of
Should
fun.
be. I'm super excited. Really just starting to study, and larks. Oh my gosh, there are a lot of larks and warblers we need to learn.
Gosh, no kidding. Yep.
Yeah, should be great. Anyway, thank you for listening to podcast number 3.
Thank you.
And stay tuned for podcast number 4 next time with James Bradley. That'll be my first Skype interview since he lives in Victoria and is not going to drive down. So excited to see how that works. And be sure to subscribe to the Bird Banter podcast on the iTunes Store, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast feeds from. And until next time, this is Ed Pullen from Bird Banter. Good birding. Good day.